the brutal punishments of enslaved women in ancient Athens you weren't meant to know. In the marble halls and private chambers of ancient Athens, beneath the philosophical discussions of democracy and justice that have defined Western civilization's understanding of human rights and moral progress, there existed a hidden world of systematic brutality and dehumanization that contradicted every principle the Athenians claimed to champion: the deliberate and methodical torture, abuse, and degradation of enslaved women who were treated not as human beings, but as property subject to punishments so severe and inhumane that they were deliberately concealed from public view and excluded from the historical records that celebrated Athenian achievements in law, philosophy, and political development. This is the investigation into how the civilization that gave birth to concepts of democracy, individual rights, and rational justice simultaneously created one of history's most sophisticated and brutal systems for controlling, punishing, and destroying the lives of enslaved women through methods that were designed to break their spirits, eliminate their humanity, and transform them into completely submissive instruments of their masters through the application of calculated cruelty that modern sensibilities can barely comprehend. Today, we explore the fragmentary legal texts, archaeological evidence, and scattered references in ancient literature that reveal the hidden reality of how Athenian society systematically brutalized enslaved women while simultaneously developing the philosophical and legal foundations that would inspire concepts of human dignity and individual rights for future generations, creating one of history's most profound contradictions between stated ideals and actual practice. Our investigation begins with the legal framework that governed enslaved women in classical Athens, where the law explicitly defined these individuals not as people, but as animate property whose masters possessed absolute authority to inflict any form of punishment, torture, or abuse they deemed necessary for maintaining discipline, extracting information, or simply satisfying personal desires for dominance and control. Athenian legal codes reveal how enslaved women existed in a state of complete legal vulnerability, with no protection from abuse, no right to testimony in their own defense, and no recourse against masters who chose to inflict even the most extreme forms of physical and psychological torture as punishment for perceived infractions or simply as expressions of unlimited power over human beings treated as possessions. The economic value placed on enslaved women created a perverse system where their punishment was carefully calculated to inflict maximum suffering while preserving their ability to continue working, leading to the development of sophisticated torture techniques that could break spirits and enforce submission without permanently damaging the economic investment they represented to their owners. Archaeological evidence from Athenian domestic sites reveals the physical infrastructure of enslavement, including specialized rooms equipped with restraining devices, torture implements, and confinement systems that were designed specifically for punishing and controlling enslaved women in ways that would be invisible to the broader Athenian society that preferred not to acknowledge the brutal realities underlying their comfortable lifestyles. The testimony requirements of Athenian law created additional opportunities for the systematic torture of enslaved women, as their statements were only considered legally valid if extracted through torture, leading to the institutionalization of brutal interrogation techniques that were applied regardless of whether the women were suspected of any wrongdoing, simply because the law demanded that their testimony be validated through suffering. Contemporary legal speeches reveal how Athenian courts regularly heard cases that involved the torture of enslaved women as a routine part of legal proceedings, with detailed descriptions of the methods used to extract testimony that demonstrate the casual acceptance of extreme cruelty as a normal part of the judicial process that supposedly embodied Athenian concepts of justice and rational law. The domestic sphere of Athenian households concealed extensive systems of punishment and control that were designed to maintain absolute authority over enslaved women through combinations of physical abuse, psychological manipulation, and social isolation that were intended to eliminate any possibility of resistance or rebellion against their masters' unlimited power over their bodies and lives. Private household accounts and inventory records reveal how enslaved women were routinely subjected to punishments that included prolonged confinement in underground chambers, deliberate starvation, systematic beatings, and various forms of sexual abuse that were considered legitimate expressions of masters' property rights rather than criminal acts requiring legal intervention or social condemnation. The philosophical writings of prominent Athenians, while celebrating concepts of human dignity and rational governance, simultaneously contain casual references to the brutal treatment of enslaved women that reveal how completely these practices were integrated into the daily life of the society that produced the foundational texts of Western political and moral philosophy. Medical texts from the period describe treatments for injuries commonly suffered by enslaved women, including broken bones, severe lacerations, and various forms of trauma that were clearly the result of systematic abuse. Yet these medical discussions treat such injuries as routine occupational hazards rather than evidence of criminal violence requiring investigation or prevention. The religious festivals and public ceremonies of Athens included rituals that involved the punishment and humiliation of enslaved women as entertainment for citizens who gathered to celebrate their democratic institutions and cultural achievements, creating spectacular displays of cruelty that were simultaneously public entertainment and reinforcement of social hierarchies based on the complete dehumanization of the enslaved population. Archaeological investigations of Athenian cemeteries have revealed evidence of how enslaved women who died from their punishments were disposed of in mass graves without individual identification or funeral rites, demonstrating how their deaths were treated as matters of no social significance despite the sophisticated burial practices accorded to free citizens who died during the same period. The economic records of Athenian households reveal how the punishment of enslaved women was often connected to their productive capacity, with brutal disciplinary measures applied when they failed to meet quotas for textile production, food preparation, or other domestic labor that generated wealth for their masters while subjecting the workers to impossible standards enforced through systematic violence. Literary works from the period contain scattered references to the suicide of enslaved women who chose death rather than continued subjection to the brutal punishments inflicted by their masters, suggesting that the level of suffering was so extreme that many individuals preferred to end their lives rather than endure the systematic cruelty that characterized their daily existence in Athenian households. The training and education of enslaved women included deliberate programs of psychological conditioning designed to break their sense of individual identity and replace it with complete submission to their master's will, using techniques that combined physical punishment, social isolation, and systematic humiliation to create compliant individuals who would not resist even the most extreme forms of abuse. Legal documents reveal how disputes between Athenian citizens over the ownership or treatment of enslaved women were resolved through procedures that treated these individuals as pure property, with their suffering and preferences considered irrelevant to legal decisions that focused exclusively on protecting the economic interests and property rights of their masters. The export of enslaved women from Athens to other parts of the Greek world created networks of human trafficking that deliberately sought out individuals who had been properly trained through brutal punishment systems, suggesting that the Athenian methods of breaking and controlling enslaved women were considered particularly effective by other societies seeking compliant forced labor. Contemporary accounts of military campaigns describe how captured women were systematically subjected to the same brutal conditioning techniques used in domestic slavery, with detailed procedures for breaking resistance and establishing submission through combinations of physical torture, sexual abuse, and psychological manipulation that were considered standard military practices rather than war crimes. The philosophical schools of Athens, while developing sophisticated theories about human nature, justice, and moral behavior, operated institutions that relied on the labor of brutally punished enslaved women whose treatment contradicted every principle these philosophers claimed to discover about human dignity, rational behavior, and the foundations of ethical conduct in civilized society. Modern archaeological techniques have revealed evidence of widespread malnutrition, physical trauma, and premature death among enslaved women in Athens, providing scientific confirmation of the systematic brutality that characterized their lives while demonstrating how these practices were concealed from contemporary observers who preferred to focus on the cultural and political achievements that made Athens famous throughout the ancient world. The legacy of Athenian practices regarding enslaved women influenced legal systems throughout the ancient Mediterranean, with other societies adopting similar techniques for controlling and punishing enslaved populations based on methods that had been perfected in the city-state that simultaneously developed the philosophical and legal foundations for concepts of human rights and democratic governance. As we examine the fragmentary evidence, archaeological remains, and scattered textual references that preserve glimpses of this hidden history, we discover how one of humanity's most celebrated civilizations simultaneously created one of its most systematic and brutal institutions for dehumanizing and destroying the lives of enslaved women through punishments so severe and methodical that they were deliberately concealed from the historical record, revealing the profound contradiction between the Athenian ideals that inspired modern concepts of human dignity and the reality of a society that treated large numbers of women as property subject to unlimited cruelty while celebrating itself as the birthplace of democracy, justice, and rational civilization.